Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening I'm joined by Greg Lukianoff, and we're going to be talking about freedom of speech on campuses specifically. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're with FIRE, and FIRE stands for?
Well, I'm the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and we defend free speech, due process, and basic rights on American college campuses.
So why are those important, and how did you get involved with that?
Well, I went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. I've been a lifelong fan of freedom of speech. My dad's a Russian immigrant, my mom's a British immigrant, and if they had their way, I wouldn't be allowed to say different things with Russian and British perspectives. So free speech being a rule made immediate sense to me as a kid coming from these really divergent backgrounds. And so I was the weird law student. I went to Stanford and who came in wanting to do First Amendment law. So I specialized in it the entire time. I even volunteered at the ACLU of Northern California. I did credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. And when I graduated, I was recruited for this new organization, FIRE. And despite all of my experience and knowing a lot about the history of freedom of speech globally, I was not prepared for the kind of things that could get you in trouble on the modern college campus.
Tell me about that. Give me some examples of the thought police running rampant and stopping people from expressing themselves.
Well, I wrote a book called Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate, and it comes out in paperback on March 11th. Okay. And it's hard for me to relate so many of these stories, but I'll give you a couple famous examples. I'll give you one that just settled just very recently to show you how bad it's gotten. There was a student at Modesto Junior College, and obviously Modesto, who was stopped from handing out, by the school, from handing out copies of the Constitution in the public areas to celebrate Constitution Day.
Okay. And so that's offensive to people. No, I've handed out constitutions at parades, and you can actually really offend people.
We also had, at the same time, virtually the same time, we had a case in Hawaii where students were being told that they couldn't hand out copies of the Constitution. And, as bad as that is, the fact that this doesn't resort in full-scale student revolt, the fact that they kind of take these kind of punishments for granted or these kind of prohibitions for granted shows you just how far down we've come.
Well, the Constitution has crazy stuff in it, like
yes.
The First Amendment. You don't want people knowing that they have those kinds of...
And the Third Amendment.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of cases that you will chase after. But you and I were talking a little bit before the show. You'll actually go after other things that maybe you don't agree with. But it's all about the First Amendment.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I worry about the polarization of our society because I take it for granted that it's almost like cheating if you're a First Amendment defender to only defend opinions you agree with. That's not the point. We don't need that. We have enough partisan people. So FIRE is passionately nonpartisan, and we defend views all across the political spectrum. But even though we're perfectly happy to defend truly offensive speech, it's so easy to get in trouble on a college campus.
And so, but freedom of speech goes beyond just handing out pamphlets.
Yep.
What kinds of other things are people saying out there that you've had to defend against, or you would have gladly taken the case if you were required to?
Well, it's probably one of the most famous cases that we've had, the extent to which we've ever had sort of a famous case, that I talk about in the book, but it just bears repeating, is a student at a public college in Indiana was reading a book called Notre Dame versus the Klan. The book is about the defeat of the Klan when they marched on Notre Dame in 1924. It celebrates the defeat of the Klan when they marched on Notre Dame in 1924. But he was found guilty of racial harassment because the cover was found offensive by an employee.
Because it had the K word on it.
Because it had the K word on it.
Wow. And so even people who are trying to do their best to be good citizens end up in trouble in this new era of political correctness.
Absolutely. It's almost like on campuses people have just sort of moved to a hair trigger. Yeah.
And so you talk about the polarization, and this whole political correctness has driven it. What kinds of things have you seen as actual, or are people even trying to remedy the situation on college campuses? And when you do litigate against them, are you able to affect their policies in any way to allow common sense to exist on their campuses?
Well, I'm very proud of how successful FIRE has been. We win the overwhelming majority of cases we fight, and we primarily fight them through public awareness. We take a case public, we do a press release about it, and the university backs down. The problem is, though, that politically correct speech codes came into existence in the 1980s, and it's popularly believed that these things came and went, that they were defeated in the courts. There was one at Stanford, by the way, which was defeated 2 years before I started there, back in 1995. And so, but amazingly, when we did our most recent survey of over 400 top universities, we found that 59% of them maintain codes that are laughably unconstitutional. And keep in mind that that's an improvement from when we started doing this.
What kind of policies would fall into that category of wildly unconstitutional? Because, I mean, we hear all the time that people are upset because of the limitation of speech on campuses, and that only one view is represented, and that it's not about how to think, it's what to think. Give me some examples of those policies that are egregious.
I mean, there's just so many of them. We list them at thefire.org. We actually have a speech code of the month every month since 2005, and we're in no danger of running out of material. But to give you some examples, one of my favorites, because it was so tenacious, believe it or not, was a ban on inappropriately directed laughter.
Really?
University of Connecticut had this policy. It was defeated. It had to go to a court to be defeated. Amazingly, University of Connecticut was like, yep, this code makes sense. Let's defend it. And of course, it was shot down by a court. But amazingly, Drexel University in Philadelphia, where Fire has its headquarters, took this policy in total and put it back in its own policies until Fire brought some, maybe inappropriately directed laughter towards it.
And I would be so expelled.
Well, and what scares me the most is when I talk about these codes on campus, and some of them, they're so vague. They talk about creating like a vague sense of unease, like they're so subjective. But students have gotten so used to these kind of codes that I have to explain to, the students who come to my speeches, every single one of you is guilty of violating this code, at least arguably enough to get in trouble.
Right. So, morbid curiosity, what kind of cases have you lost?
What kind of cases have we lost? Over the years, I think that probably in some cases, the hardest schools to fight are the small community colleges, because in some cases they're not all that concerned about their reputation, and they have job security, and that actually got me thinking about what you need to achieve in order to actually start setting things right on college campuses. And one thing that you need is you need to start creating consequences for bad administrators.
Like what?
Well, there was a case. I opened up my book on learning liberty, talking about a case where a student, and I can't do it justice, like even in the full half hour, where a student was kicked out of college for protesting a parking garage with a collage he put on Facebook. He was kicked out of school for this. And when it all came out, it turned out that the university president was so obsessed with starting this parking garage that he wasn't bearing any criticism of it whatsoever. It's completely just
narcissistic. That's my design, my baby. No one will call my baby ugly.
It's really, really strange behavior in this case. And that case was considered so bad by a court that they pierced what's called qualified immunity, which means that, at least in theory, the president should pay out of his own pocket because he was so clearly ignoring the Constitution. And if administrators could start to realize or start to actually believe that they might be held personally responsible for some of these abuses, we might start seeing some change.
Well, and I think that can go way beyond just the situation of college campuses. That's something that should be universally applicable.
Absolutely.
If you're that stupid, you should pay a consequence.
Right. Well, and when it comes to it, if we had more students willing to fight their speech codes, we could make short work of speech codes, I believe. But unfortunately, I think sometimes students think it's a lot harder and a lot scarier to actually be party to some of these lawsuits.
Well, because they're also concerned about retaliation.
Yes.
And so, is that the primary driver for people just complying? Is they're concerned about retaliation, or?
I think it's a little bit of human.
For them to file suit or whatever.
I think honestly, I think why would they not want to file suit? I think they're under the misimpression that it's a lot harder to be in a lawsuit than it is, and they also are afraid of retaliation. And which we point out, if you file a lawsuit and the university kicks you out, or suddenly you get all Fs, or they're only going to get sued that much more after the fact. And so sometimes I think students think, go along to get along, keep your head low, and I have to explain to them time and time again, the students who say that are the ones that I talk to in private, begging them to take their case public or to litigate, and those are the ones who end up being kicked out. Those are the ones who end up, or if they're professors, losing their jobs.
because they haven't stood up for themselves.
And you're much safer in public. And I've seen this happen a million times. If you're not willing to go in public, they can quietly get rid of you. Meanwhile, if you're being covered in the local newspapers, or better yet, the national press, you're a lot safer.
So when do you make the decision that something's a local case versus a national case, or does the media decide for you?
You know, that's a really great question. It can be really funny because we deal with so many cases every year. I mean, we get 500 case submissions a year, and in addition to that, we find cases from all different sources. And when you take a case public that you know within Fire, we might think, oh my goodness, this is an absolutely ridiculous case. The press might not care, and then randomly you discover one that the press just kind of runs with for some reason that you didn't entirely understand. Like a case that I felt like never got really enough attention. For one, the Indiana case, I felt like never got quite enough attention, which is one of the reasons why I mention it all the time. But
you're making up for that attention
yeah,
that wasn't gotten before.
Exactly. But University of Cincinnati, this is a case where a student, a libertarian student group, they were trying to get signatures for a ballot initiative, a right-to-work ballot initiative. And they were told, and they needed to get it before the deadline. And they were told that not only could they not petition the government for redress of grievances, which might sound familiar to you, that they had to get advanced state permission 10 days in advance in order to use the free speech zone that was only 0.1% of campus, and that if they were seen, quote unquote, walking around campus, these are students, mind you, that they would be arrested for trespass.
In a school that they pay to attend.
In a public school they pay to attend.
It's just wildness. I'm curious if you were tracking the Berkeley case. I mean, there wasn't really a case at all, but seeing what the Berkeley students did about their racially motivated bake sale at all. And if you thought that was going to be something coming your way, or
affirmative action bake sales, which people might not know about them, they're a way of sort of satirizing affirmative action.
Sure.
And the point is to actually anger people by charging different prices for people according to race. Now they're suggested it's just completely parody, but to make a point,
right.
And it's effective in getting people angry. John Stossel actually conducted his own affirmative action bake sale in the streets of New York, and then he watched it as it produced a lot of debate. These things have been going on for a really long time. And we've intervened in a lot of them, and we've also pointed out that a lot of these colleges do what are called, also at the same time, do gender gap bake sales, which charge people different amounts of money according to whether they're male or female to protest the gender gap in pay. And those never get in trouble. But when you change the opinion, when it's actually one that's anti-affirmative action, that's when students start landing in trouble. And the point that I made, there was UC Irvine shut down one of these bake sales very early on. And I remember talking to the press about this. Like, listen, if you really want to make a cause famous, censor it. Because the students who actually had this bake sale are suddenly known all over the country because you censored it. Allowing them to have their legitimate protest is, one, your duty, but two, it's also, it keeps the message, as a discussion among students for the most part.
So have you noticed in your practice recurring themes, specific things that do you see more of the I love Hitler types of students that you have to
right.
Represent, or more the religious freedom types?
Yep.
What trends do you see across the country?
Well, I always say, like, I'm willing to defend hateful speech, but the students who get in trouble on college campuses, 9 times out of 10 are really nice kids, because it's so easy to get in trouble on college campuses that it even pulls in the nice kids. But I've definitely seen, it goes in waves. There are trends. Free speech zones are a trend, which I've mentioned a couple times. It definitely, and my liberal friends hate me saying this, but you are definitely more likely to get in trouble for a socially conservative opinion, which I think will really come as a surprise to nobody.
Right.
But also, we had a phase there where people were using their First Amendment rights to argue for their Second Amendment rights. And we actually did a whole video about cases in which students were getting in trouble for protesting for, like, concealed carry, for example.
Or open carry even, too.
Yeah, or open carry, for example. And then you just have, crazy one-off cases that are sort of fun. We had a case that involved a professor getting in trouble for a quote from the much beloved but short-lived TV show Firefly.
Okay.
And that was a really funny case to watch, because when he got in trouble for it, this brought all the fans, including myself. Like, I'm a huge fan of this defunct show. It's a Joss Whedon show. Okay. And you have tens of thousands of angry fans suddenly are coming in. But what that case drove home to me was that, you hit a beloved TV show and suddenly everybody's all up in arms. But, I wish we had that same constituency just for free speech on college campuses.
Right. And so, as far as your book goes, you go into all of these different stories. Do you have something that you want people to leave with, or an idea, a concept, how to fight for their freedom of speech?
Well, the two things are pretty well represented by the title. Unlearning Liberty, but by that I mean that students are learning all the wrong lessons of what it means to live in a free society. Okay. And that scares me. Mm-hmm. The End of American Debate part of it is how this censorship actually encourages people to just talk to the people they already agree with, thus fostering polarization, which you can really see on campus and in our society. But the way to fight back is to get educated, to talk across lines of difference. That makes a huge difference. Be reasonable, host debates, and be willing to litigate if it comes down to it. And as I said before, if more students were willing to do that, I think we could really make some positive changes for campus.
And how many of your cases actually go to the litigation stage versus the court of public opinion?
Very few. We don't like to primarily rely on litigation, but because I think one of the reasons why this has gotten so out of hand is because university general counsels think in some cases it's safer to punish students or to stifle students than it is to protect their rights. That you have to change that incentive structure, and unfortunately, I think the only ways you're really going to achieve that is one, more litigation, and two, possibly some legislative fixes. Some as simple as just defining, for example, harassment.
Right.
Harassment is defined on campuses and has been defined on campuses, including Stanford, since 1989, in these wildly overbroad ways that bear no resemblance to the legal definition of harassment. If Congress were to just pass a rule that said harassment means what the Supreme Court said harassment means in the 1999 case of Davis, it would eliminate a substantial portion of speech codes in one fell swoop.
So, what was the definition by the Supreme Court in 1999 in the Davis case?
In the Davis case, severe, persistent, and pervasive. That it's targeted and unwelcome speech. It was a student-on-student case involving, actually in this case, K through 12 students. And by that strong definition, it's no longer really speech. It really is harassing behavior.
Harassment, hazing, something. It goes much more than just, you offended me.
Exactly.
Right.
And if the Congress were to adopt that definition, and we hope they will, that would eliminate a lot of the ambiguity around this. And
so are there movements to take legislative directions with this type of freedom of speech violation?
FIRE is alone in a lot of different ways, and one of the ways in which we're alone is on the Hill, trying to argue for some of these common sense changes. The nice thing is...
That's the problem. You try to bring common sense to Capitol Hill. Shame on you.
I have to tell you, though, there have been a bunch of... the Virginia state government just passed a bill that protects free speech on college campuses, addressing the problem of free speech zones. So we've had... there is more common sense, I think. Believe it or not, I think there is more common sense in Washington or in state governments than there is on campus in a lot of different ways.
That's a scary statement all in itself, but we'll allow you to freely speak it here. So talk to me about free speech zones. Mm-hmm. Having been a recovering politician, they always try to attempt to regulate where you can stand, and they want it to be where no one can hear you anyway. That's the freedom of speech zone, because you're by yourself anyway, nobody cares.
Yep.
So what is your thought on free speech zones? And should they even be constitutionally allowed?
There is such a thing as a perfectly constitutional free speech zone policy. So, for example, University of Texas had one that I have no problem with. I actually thought it was a good one, which limited to relatively large zones on campus the areas in which you could use amplification equipment. That's perfectly reasonable, saying, like, listen, we don't want classes to be disrupted. This is where you can use amplification. But what's ironic about free speech zones is they started, as best we can tell, in the 60s and 70s as an additional place you could always have free speech. And somehow in the 80s, 90s, they morphed into the only place you were allowed to have free speech.
So why is that's just a curious historical reference? I mean, why would someone need a place where they could always have free speech? Why should it be limited at all?
Well, as long as it's not the only place, then it's fine. Then it's nice. It's like Speaker's Corner in London, and that's pretty cool. But with the mass bureaucratization of campuses, they've kind of overregulated everything. And a lot of people don't know that the number of people involved in administration full-time passed the number of people involved in instruction on college campuses in 2005. And the trend lines just keep getting worse and worse.
So you have to have more personnel for compliance than you have for educating students, which explains the cost of education pretty soundly, I would think.
They're all connected. So I think it's particularly galling that we're paying more than ever to have larger armies of campus administrators and bureaucrats who promise very little in the way of due process and very little in the way of free speech. And actually, because there's so many of them, you get less and less, and you get more and more sort of babysitting mentality.
Incredible. Yep. And that's how bureaucracy works generally. Yep. So. We have a few minutes left. Talk to us about, you've talked about legislative ways that you might address things. We now dub you King of the World. I'm free to say that. I don't support the whole royalty thing. But are there any other things we should be thinking about, or any other movements people could get behind to educate the country specifically about how they can fight for freedom of speech?
The biggest goal of FIRE is to change the culture. I'm afraid that freedom of speech, and there's unfortunately research that indicates this, that for the younger generation, First Amendment and freedom of speech doesn't have the same kind of...
It's because they're not allowed to read the Constitution.
Well, right. Grandeur that it used to. But I think if we were to, as far as different ways we could actually really help, what if you had, during orientation, proper Oxford-style debates, where you actually have to take the other side of a point of view and
defend it,
but on a genuinely controversial topic.
Yes.
I spoke about this up at Harvard, by the way, and a student came up to me and said, I was trying to do this, but they wouldn't let us have the other side, and I was like, that's crazy.
Right.
So I think that would be great training, because it's hard to view someone you disagree with after you've put yourself in their shoes as being crazy, and it really helps you appreciate the value of thought experimentation, of devil's advocacy, of all these things that make ideas better.
Right. And so, but it also requires not getting along with everybody that you run into, right? And that's countercultural at this point too. We're told we need to get along and we need to respect others' opinions. We're not, but that means don't share yours.
Yeah, exactly. It's been amazing. I mean, with regards to trends that I didn't manage to talk about, I'm not particularly religious, but it definitely has been the case that, how often I've had to come to defend evangelical Christians on college campuses. I mean, like that, if you told me that I'd spend a lot of time doing that before I worked for FIRE, I'd be like, oh, that's got to be some kind of myth. But now that having done it for 12 years, I'm just stunned.
And so they're going to bring you over to the religious side eventually. It'll happen because you have to keep defending. So just so people can learn more about you and what's going on, the name of the book again is?
Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship, and the End of American Debate.
And they can find out about it at your website?
At thefire.org, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education.
Okay, great. Well, Greg, thanks for joining us this evening. And if you hold on for just a second, we'll be back after a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to the right side. That was a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. And the Conservative Forum, as much as we appreciate them underwriting the show, that's not actually what they're best known for. What they are best known for is their speaker series. And that's the reason we were lucky enough to have Greg with us in the studio this evening. He's the speaker at the forum tonight. This forum usually meets the first Tuesday of each month, and that happens, and that will be changing in November. But other than that, only in July is it different. But they meet at 432 Stearland Road here in Mountain View at the IFES Portuguese Hall, about 3 minutes from the studio. And just so you know, upcoming speakers also include in April, on the 1st, Dr. Bert Folsom from Hillsdale. In May, speaking of free speech, Sheriff Joe Arpaio will be speaking, and that's sure to bring some freedom of speech, not only inside the halls, but probably outside too. In June, Nani Darwish, founder of Arabs for Israel. And then August 5th, there will be a meeting that'll be spoken at by Gun Owners of America. There's lots to see, lots of freedom of speech expressed at the forum. So please join us there. Shows usually start around, I think doors open at 6:30, and the actual presentation starts at 7. You can learn more at the Conservative Forum at the conservativeforum.com if I've forgotten anything. But in closing, I just wanted to point out that freedom of speech is something that's vital to us as citizens of the United States, and we sometimes take for granted that we have that right, or we take for granted that we're letting it slip away piece by piece and inch by inch, where we really do need to stand up and protect it. So learn more about at thefire.org, learn more about Greg and his book, and we encourage you to get involved in the fight. Because if you don't protect your freedom of speech and exercise it regularly, no one else will do it for you. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening on The Right Side. Again, I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in person or on the show sometime soon. Thanks.